Hey everyone, and welcome to my third video analyzing the techniques I've learned while studying the writing style of Patrick Rothfuss, all excerpts taken from his novels The Name of the Wind and The Wise Man's Fear. In this video, I'll be looking at how Rothfuss uses comparisons such as metaphors and similes to enhance his descriptions of settings, characters, actions, feelings, as well as abstract or supernatural phenomena. Unlike my last video, where I did a deep dive into the riveting subject of conjunctions, discussing Rothfuss's comparisons will allow me to put his true talents on display as I analyze some of his most exceptional prose. So if you want to understand this key component of Rothfuss's writing style, be sure to stick around. I don't think I need to preface this video with any definitions or context, so let us dispense with the preamble and dive right into our first and most straightforward category, comparisons that enhance descriptions of settings. We'll start with the first of two subcategories, namely examples that describe the appearance of a given setting. There were 2 fewer stools than there should be at the bar, and an empty space left by an absent table. In the orderly tap room, these things were conspicuous as missing teeth. Centuries of use had worn down the stone, making the stairs look as bowed as heavy-laden shelves. As we started down, the shadows made the steps look smooth and dark and edgeless, like an abandoned riverbed worn from the rock. In both of these examples, Rothfuss is using evocative imagery to describe one aspect of a setting's visual appearance. In the first, Rothfuss is attempting to give the reader a sense of something being conspicuous or out of place, and so decided to use the simile, conspicuous as missing teeth, which I think is brilliant because not only does it strike the reader as something that is glaringly obvious, it also refers to an empty space that one feels inclined to fill. In the second example, we have stairs being compared to bowed, heavy-laden shelves, which provides a great visual that everyone can relate to. And then we have the steps being compared to an abandoned riverbed worn from the rock, in how smooth, dark, and edgeless they are. This is a great comparison because not only does it evoke strong imagery, it also implies that, like a riverbed worn from the rock, these steps have been eroded over centuries. The second subcategory of comparisons that enhance the setting do so by capturing the tone or feel of a place. These streets weren't dangerous, strictly speaking, or rather, they were dangerous in a broken glass sort of way. Broken glass won't go out of its way to hurt you. You can even touch it if you're careful. Some streets are dangerous as frothing dogs, where no amount of care will keep you safe. This description of setting is terrific. Not only is this street's degree of danger compared to broken glass, while that of other more dangerous streets is compared to frothing dogs, both of which evoke visceral reactions from the reader, Rothfuss is also comparing one street to another, and thus comparing broken glass to frothing dogs. This is one of many examples of how Rothfuss likes to elaborate on his comparisons, as we'll see later on, so as to really flesh out his intended meaning. In your own writing, don't feel like you have to complete the comparison within a single sentence. Sometimes it's better to elaborate and let your prose breathe. Let's move on to the second category, comparisons that enhance descriptions of characters. We'll start with the first of 4 subcategories, namely examples that describe the appearance of a given character. Completing our quartet was Manet. His wild gray hair and habitually rumpled clothes made him look vaguely bewildered, as if he'd just woken up and couldn't quite remember where he was. In fact, the innkeeper himself seemed rather sickly, not exactly unhealthy, but hollow, wan, like a plant that's been moved into the wrong sort of soil, and, lacking something vital, has begun to wilt. While both of these excellent examples describe very different characters, the first being a rather comical description of an older, vaguely bewildered man, and the second being a solemn description of a young innkeeper waiting to die, both descriptions follow a similar pattern with regards to how they each contain 3 stages of elaboration. First we have a physical description, which in the first is wild gray hair and habitually rumpled clothes, and in the second is sickly. Followed by an elaboration on said description, which in the first is vaguely bewildered, and in the second is not exactly unhealthy but hollow, wan. Followed by a second elaboration that involves a comparison. In the first, Manet is described as someone who had just woken up and couldn't quite remember where he was, while in the second, the innkeeper is described as a plant that's been moved into the wrong sort of soil, and, lacking something vital, has begun to wilt. Rothfuss writes these 3-stage descriptions to great effect, and I myself have certainly acquired the taste. In the interest of time, I won't dive too deeply into this third example of using comparison to describe the appearance of a character, but I wanted to include it because it's a great example of using both contrast as well as archetypal comparisons, referring the reader to archetypes that are well established in our collective psyches. You find 2 types of mayor in small towns like this. The first type are balding, older men of considerable girth who are good with money and tend to wring their hands a great deal when anything unexpected happens. The second type are tall, broad-shouldered men whose families have grown slowly prosperous because they had worked like angry bastards behind a plow for 20 generations. Al's father was the second sort. Let's move on to the second subcategory, namely comparisons that describe a given character's expression. His expression couldn't have been more horrified if he had found me carrying a freshly severed head. Denna looked up at me then, the irritation fading from her face. She gave me a look that was all sweet fondness and mingled pity. It was the sort of look you give a puppy when it growls, thinking itself terribly fierce. The first example is a simple, albeit evocative, comparison, likening a character's expression to the look of horror one might adopt if one had found me carrying a freshly severed head. But, like our previous examples, this second example has 3 stages. The first is the irritation fading from her face. The second is a look that was all sweet fondness and mingled pity. And the third elaborates on the second by comparing said look to the sort of look you give a puppy when it growls, thinking itself terribly fierce. This is a great way of describing sweet fondness and mingled pity, because this sort of description of a puppy who thinks itself terribly fierce evokes a universal awe in the reader. As I mentioned in the video I made a while ago on similes and metaphors, linked below, piggybacking on these sorts of relatable feelings is the key to writing evocative comparisons. Let's move on to the third subcategory, namely comparisons that describe the tone of a given character's dialogue. "Coat, sir," Coat replied in an indulgent tone that mothers use on children and innkeepers use on drunks. "Ye interrupt me again, and I'll knock your teeth right out." He said it without any particular emphasis, as if he were letting me know that if I jumped into the river, I was bound to get wet. In both of these examples, notice how Rothfuss, once again, uses the comparison as a way of elaborating on a more basic description. In the first, Rothfuss comically elaborates on an indulgent tone by comparing it to the one mothers use on children and innkeepers use on drunks. In the second, he elaborates on the tone without any particular emphasis by comparing it to the exceedingly blunt and obvious way a man might let me know that if I jumped into the river, I was bound to get wet. Again, both of these comparisons are very relatable to the reader, and allow them to overlay the tone of something more familiar onto what has just been said. Now for the fourth and final subcategory, that is, comparisons that describe the nature of a given character. I've got 2 examples, and I'll tackle them one at a time. Ambrose was leaning toward her, speaking in a low voice. She had the distinctly uncomfortable look of a woman who knows the futility of a polite refusal. One of his hands rested on her knee, while the other arm was draped across the back of her chair, his hand resting on her neck. He meant for it to look tender and affectionate, but there was a tension in her body like that of a startled deer. The truth was he was holding her there, the same way you hold a dog by the scruff of its neck to keep it from running off. Here we see 3 back-to-back comparisons, each one elaborating on the one that came before. First, she had the distinctly uncomfortable look of a woman who knows the futility of a polite refusal. Next, Rothfuss describes the man's actions before contrasting his intentions, namely to look tender and affectionate, with the reality, comparing the tension in her body to that of a startled deer. Rothfuss then elaborates further with a third comparison by stating that he was holding her there, the same way you hold a dog by the scruff of its neck to keep it from running off. All in all, these comparisons work together to describe the sort of person Ambrose is. That is to say, he is the kind of man who is very forward with women in a creepy, pushy sort of way. By comparing the woman to a startled deer, and a woman who knows the futility of a polite refusal, Rothfuss captures her situation quite vividly, the same way holding a dog by the scruff of its neck captures Ambrose's unseemly personality. This next example illustrates how Rothfuss uses comparisons to describe a character's nature via dialogue. He looked back at me and gestured vaguely with his hands. You see, women are like fires, like flames. Some women are like candles, bright and friendly. Some are like single sparks or embers, like fireflies for chasing on summer nights. Some are like campfires, all light and heat for a night and willing to be left after. Some women are like hearth fires, not much to look at, but underneath they are all warm red coal that burns for a long, long while. But Diane is like a waterfall of spark pouring off a sharp iron edge that God is holding to the grindstone. This description is great because not only are all these comparisons, 7 in total, centered around the same theme, that is, a certain man's interpretation of womankind, comparing them to various types of fire. Rothfuss also uses these first 6 comparisons as a setup to contrast with the ultimate 7th comparison, namely how Diane is like a waterfall of spark pouring off a sharp iron edge that God is holding to the grindstone. In so doing, Rothfuss sets Diane apart from every other woman in a stark, dramatic way. This chunk of writing is so packed full of evocative comparisons that there is even a small comparison within a one-line comparison within the ultimate comparison, likening the sparks pouring off an iron edge that is being held to a grindstone to a waterfall. Once again, the rule of 3 emerges, something that pops up in every aspect of writing. I even made a video on it a while back as it pertains to the adjectives and descriptions written by George R.R. Martin, linked below. But enough of character. Let's move on to the third of the 5 categories, comparisons that enhance descriptions of actions. I didn't identify any particular subcategories, but one common theme did emerge, namely how Rothfuss uses comparisons to link uncommon actions with actions that are bound to be more familiar to the reader. Pay attention to this strategy as I read all 4 examples back to back. I will highlight the unfamiliar in red and the familiar in blue. My search was more a ritual than anything. Looking for Denna was an exercise in futility, like praying for fair weather. Tempe stepped close, struck him in the head with casual precision, then watched the man slump limply to the ground. It was, I thought idly, the most polite punch I'd ever seen. It was the careful blow of a skilled carpenter pounding a nail, hard enough to drive it fully home, but not so hard as to bruise the wood around it. Fool that I was, I'd assumed he had already been teaching me. The truth was, he had merely been correcting my more horrifying mistakes because they irritated him, much the same way I'd be tempted to tune someone's lute if they were playing off-key in the same room. The sweat on my hands froze my fingers to the canister's fastenings, the same way a curious child's tongue sticks to a pump handle in the dead of winter. A lazier writer would have been content with describing what's in red, but Rothfuss, in his typical fashion, goes the extra mile and makes each of these comparisons more relatable, thus immersing the reader more deeply in the narrative. Now for the fourth category, comparisons that enhance descriptions of those troublesome little things so difficult for we writers to describe. Feelings. If only we could simply write, he was sad, or she was happy, but alas, our readers expect a little more heavy lifting. Oftentimes, the best way to describe a complex or nuanced feeling is to compare it with, you guessed it, something more relatable. So let's see what we can learn from Patrick Rothfuss. Since I've got 4 examples for this category, let's take them one at a time. I didn't often think of my early life in my troop, back when my parents were alive. I avoided the subject the same way a cripple learns to keep the weight off an injured leg. Here we have a character who is trying to avoid certain traumatic memories. So as a writer, we must ask ourselves, what else might someone avoid doing that is more relatable to the average reader? In this instance, Rothfuss came up with a cripple avoids putting weight on an injured leg. This evokes a very visceral sensation, as most people have suffered some degree of injury in their lives, and so will instinctively wince when they empathize with this. Moving on to the second example, Rothfuss writes, "But underneath it all, there was a tension in the room. A stranger would have never noticed it, but it was there, dark and silent as an undertow." In order to describe this vague feeling of tension in the room, Rothfuss followed the same strategy and asked himself, what else elicits a specific feeling of tension that would be more relatable to the average reader? And I think his choice of simile, dark and silent as an undertow, is superb. After all, an undertow is in fact dark and silent. It does exist underneath things, and it would also certainly make a person very tense and uncomfortable if they happen to be swimming near one. This next example demonstrates a great way of avoiding melodrama. Something inside the man suddenly gave way, and he began to cry. The deep, hopeless sobs of an honest man who has been frightened and helpless for a long time, watching the slow death of a well-loved friend. I wanted to include this example because many new and even experienced writers are often tempted to describe the actions of the sad, despairing character, perhaps describing how the tears fell like rain from his eyes, or how she wailed like a widow in mourning. There's nothing inherently wrong with writing these sorts of comparisons. In fact, in many cases they may be just what's needed, but it's often a good idea to supplement them with descriptions of why the character is crying. Here, Rothfuss gives the reason for this man's deep, hopeless sobs, saying they were the sobs of an honest man who has been frightened and helpless for a long time, watching the slow death of a well-loved friend. This gives the reader something specific to empathize with, instead of straying dangerously close to a melodramatic description of the character's crying. The last example for this category is a lengthy one, and is unique in that you can only really write something like this from a first-person perspective. It's also kind of meta with regards to the topic of narrative comparisons, saying outright how difficult and ultimately futile it is to try and describe certain feelings in words, so I thought it would be appropriate for this video. When she smiled at me, I honestly cannot think of how I could describe it. Lying would be easier. I could steal from 100 stories and tell you a lie so familiar you would swallow it whole. I could say my knees went to rubber, that my breath came hard in my chest. But that would not be the truth. My heart did not pound or stop or stutter. That is the sort of thing they say happens in stories. Foolishness, hyperbole, tripe, but still. Go out in the early days of winter, after the first cold snap of the season. Find a pool of water with a sheet of ice across the top, still fresh and new and clear as glass. Near the shore, the ice will hold you. Slide out further, farther. Eventually you'll find the place where the surface just barely bears your weight. There you will feel what I felt. The ice splinters under your feet. Look down, and you can see the white cracks darting through the ice like mad, elaborate spider webs. It is perfectly silent, but you can feel the sudden, sharp vibrations through the bottoms of your feet. That is what happened when Denna smiled at me. I don't mean to imply I felt as if I stood on brittle ice about to give way beneath me. No, I felt like the ice itself, suddenly shattered, with cracks spiraling out from where she had touched my chest. This is one of Rothfuss's more elaborate comparisons, taking his readers by the hand and guiding them on a little self-contained journey, all to describe a single feeling. He starts off by mocking cliches, which in and of themselves do much to describe what he's trying to say, then goes on to describe a very specific scenario, before doing a bit of a reversal, saying how he felt like the cracking ice itself, not the person standing on it. Many might argue that this description is overwritten, but I think therein lies the point. By writing something so lengthy, verging on convoluted, the narrator, who is also the character in question, thereby expresses the indescribable nature of what he's feeling, conveying his emotion not only by comparison, but by how he struggles to make any comparison at all. Thus far, we have discussed comparisons used to enhance descriptions of setting, characters, actions, and feelings, but there is one category still remaining, namely comparisons used to describe abstract or supernatural phenomenon. And what better examples than music, death, and magic? Let's start with a brilliant comparison that contrasts the music of a formally educated musician with that of one who has received no such formal training. I'd learned about music since before I could talk. I knew 10,000 rules of melody and verse better than I knew the backs of my own hands. Denna didn't. In some ways this hampered her, but in other ways it made her music strange and marvelous. I'm doing a poor job of explaining this. Think of music as being a great snarl of a city like Tarbeen. In the years I spent living there, I came to know its streets. Not just the main streets, not just the alleys. I knew shortcuts and rooftops and parts of the sewers. Because of this, I could move through the city like a rabbit in a bramble. I was quick and cunning and clever. Denna, on the other hand, had never been trained. She knew nothing of shortcuts. You'd think she'd be forced to wander the city, lost and helpless, trapped in a twisting maze of mortared stone. But instead, she simply walked through walls. She didn't know any better. Nobody had ever told her she couldn't. Because of this, she moved through the city like some fairy creature. She walked roads no one else could see, and it made her music wild and strange and free. This example might just be my favorite. Here, Rothfuss makes the brilliant yet unlikely comparison between music and a great snarl of a city. More specifically, he compares the prospective character's understanding of music to his knowledge of a city, explaining how he knew all the shortcuts and rooftops and sewers, and how this made him quick and cunning and clever, before contrasting his expertise with someone who has not been formally educated, and thus simply walked through walls like some fairy creature, and could see roads no one else could see. The average reader might not know that much about the technical aspects of music, but everyone understands how to navigate a city, as well as how wild and strange and free it would be if one were able to walk through walls and the like. I truly cannot give this description enough praise. It is perfect. Rothfuss wants his reader to know the difference between the styles of these two musicians, and accomplishes this to a T using an in-depth comparison that is both relatable and evocative. And, as always, the concise way he structures his sentences is masterful. Now, let's take a look at an example that uses comparisons to describe the abstract concept of death, or rather, the relationship that these particular townsfolk have with death. "Bad business last night," he said without making eye contact, then took another drink. Coate nodded. Bad business last night. Chances are, that would be all Graham had to say about the death of a man he had known his whole life. These folk knew all about death. They killed their own livestock. They died from fevers, falls, or broken bones gone sour. Death was like an unpleasant neighbor. You didn't talk about him for fear he might hear you and decide to pay a visit. Except for stories, of course. Tales of poisoned kings and duels and old wars were fine. They dressed death in foreign clothes and sent him far from your door. A chimney fire or the Krupkopf were terrifying, but Gibeah's trial or the siege of Enfast, those were different. They were like prayers, like charms muttered late at night when you were walking alone in the dark. Stories were like halfpenny amulets you bought from a peddler, just in case. Again, this narrative sequence is excellent. The more I study Rothfuss's writing, the more I learn, and the more I love it. There are two comparisons made here, and each is preceded by some descriptive setup. The first likens death to an unpleasant neighbor, who you didn't talk about for fear he might hear you and decide to pay a visit, which fits perfectly with how he previously described their intimate relationship with death, referring to how they killed their own livestock, and how they died from fevers, falls, or broken bones gone sour. The second likens stories to prayers or charms muttered late at night when you were walking alone in the dark, and to halfpenny amulets you bought from a peddler, just in case. Both of these comparisons follow a description of how real death is different when compared to the death talked about in stories, contrasting chimney fires and the Krupkopf with tales of poisoned kings and duels and old wars like Gibeah's trial or the siege of Enfast that dressed death in foreign clothes and sent him far from your door. Once again, we see how Rothfuss melds the narrative techniques of contrast and comparison to great effect. Once I started cataloging all of the excerpts I pulled from Rothfuss's writing that pertain to comparisons, I had a feeling this video would be a long one. Even still, there are countless other examples I excluded in the interest of time. Little lines like, "The things they produced in alchemy complex made arsenic look like sugar in your tea," or, "There is a sort of camaraderie that rarely exists except between men who have fought the same enemies and known the same women." But I think you're beginning to pick up on the common trends and techniques, so let's cap off this video with a description of our hero losing his magical touch upon performing magic. I could see a slight shimmer in the air around Felurian, some shred of her power returning. I ignored it as I struggled frantically to keep some part of what I had learned, but it was like trying to hold a handful of sand. If you have ever dreamed of flying, then come awake, dismayed to realize you had lost the trick of it, you have some inkling how I felt. Piece by piece, it faded until there was nothing left. I felt hollow inside and ached as badly as if I'd discovered my family never loved me. Magic can be a tricky thing to describe well, so here, Rothfuss has chosen to compare the loss of such knowledge to trying to hold a handful of sand, and then to forgetting how one managed to fly in a dream, both of which are very relatable. Then he caps off the loss of said magical knowledge by comparing the hollowness he felt inside to the hypothetical discovery that his family had never loved him. Again, this is a gut punch that the reader can readily empathize with, and helps bring this supernatural encounter down to earth. Anyway, I hope you found these comparative techniques useful. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions, and as always, like and subscribe for more technical writing videos.